Welcome back to Forensic Bites and our series on evidence collection in forensic science. Today we're going to be talking about suiting and booting, which is applying personal protective equipment to prevent contamination. What we're going to cover is how to prepare for the first phase of a criminal investigation. This is also termed the pre-submission phase, and this is before the evidence has been transported to a forensic laboratory, so sourced from a crime scene. We're going to discuss how personal protective equipment, or PPE, functions to help you avoid directly contaminating that crime scene. There is a correct sequence for applying your PPE so as to minimise the risk of contaminating it when you're donning it. And we're also going to talk about the location that you would typically apply or change your PPE, because it's not necessarily a one and done process. You are going to be regularly changing the different items of PPE that you may be wearing to mitigate cross-contamination. So one of the most important factors when preserving crime scene integrity is to have an awareness for your own capacity to contaminate either evidence or the crime scene. And this can relate to things like your own DNA, your hair, your fingerprints. All of these things can compromise evidence should there be a transfer from you onto them. Gaining this awareness allows you to take appropriate steps to minimise each source of these types of contamination. And the final thing you need is an awareness of the limitations of PPE and having the appropriate protocols that enable it to function properly. So, personal protective equipment, it serves two main purposes. The first is to protect you, the wearer. So, crime scenes are inherently hazardous. There may be bloodborne diseases like hepatitis or HIV. There could be chemical hazards. So if we're talking about a clandestine laboratory, your PPE is to protect you from these hazards that you may encounter. The next purpose is to protect the evidence from you. So as we've alluded to, you are a source of DNA, fingerprints, hairs, trace evidence. All these kinds of things will start to impact the criminal investigation should you not take steps to prevent it. For serious crimes, entering the scene will require that you wear multiple items of PPE, including the oversuit, shown here. I've also heard it called a scene suit, a boiler suit, a bunny suit, and a noddy suit, and there are doubtless many other references that the oversuit is actually called. And that includes wearing a hood, should it actually be built into the oversuit. Assuming that there's no hood, in that case, you're going to be wearing a mob cap or a hairnet, so something that keeps your hair away from the crime scene. You're going to wear overshoes, which is kind of hard to see, but we can see that there is a sort of a plastic covering going over their boots, a face mask, as well as 2 pairs of gloves. The correct order of gowning starts with a face mask, and this is to protect all of the other items of PPE from saliva aerosols, which can come about from speaking. Once that's in place, then comes the mob cap or the hairnet, which assumes that your oversuit doesn't have an inbuilt hood. With that in place, next comes the first pair of gloves, and you have to be really careful putting on the gloves so as not to contaminate the outer surfaces of the gloves as you're putting them on. Now that the outer surface of your hands is protected and covered, you can put on the oversuit at this point, followed by the overshoes. Lastly comes the second pair of gloves, and the idea is that given that you've already got your first inner layer of gloves, you can don these without getting any fingerprint residues on the outside of them. This outer layer of gloves, or the second pair of gloves, will be swapped regularly and away from the examination area. So whenever you handle an item of evidence, particularly if that evidence is some source of DNA, so think about a bloody item, you're going to handle that one item of evidence, package it, deal with it, and then you're going to change the outer pair of gloves before you move on to another item of evidence. And this is to prevent cross-contamination from an item covered in DNA with another item which may not contain that DNA on it. Powder-free gloves are used, and this is to eliminate contamination from powder present on the gloves. And no bare skin on the arm should be visible. So inner gloves are typically either extended over the scene suit, shown here, or they may even be taped physically to the sleeve. So this is to prevent any gap forming between the suit down here and the glove here. So there should be no exposed skin. For volume crime, when these are being investigated, often less precautions are taken by the investigating officers. But as a rule, gloves and a face mask should be considered essential for the investigation of any type of scene, regardless of how serious it is. This is because gloves and face masks prevent the most serious forms of contamination from the investigator. And it's worth knowing that current DNA techniques can readily generate a profile from the trace DNA of aerosolized saliva that you would get through speaking or through the skin cells that are transferred whenever you touch an object. Hence, again, gloves and face masks should be mandatory at all scenes. Knowing where and when to apply your PPE is important for the anti-contamination strategy surrounding the crime scene, and we're going to have another video on this coming up. Upon entering a scene, the PPE you're wearing is going to be recorded in the log, and by entering a scene, I mean crossing the inner cordon. For serious crime, oftentimes there will be a scene entry tent established, and this is a meeting place where people will congregate before entering into the inner cordon of a serious crime scene. This scene entry tent can be partitioned so as to create an area for applying your PPE, as well as for packaging and disposing of dirty PPE when you are swapping over between submitting an item of evidence and preparing to go back in to process a new item of evidence. And this aims to create clean and dirty zones on either side of the inner cordon. So to conclude, contamination is always going to be an ever-present risk at crime scenes, and all you can really try to do is minimise it. Depending on the seriousness of the scene, increasing amounts of barrier clothing, i.e. personal protective equipment, will be worn so as to protect you as well as to protect evidence from you. Proper order of donning is required so as to avoid contaminating the PPE when you are first applying it, and you'll need to regularly change your gloves when handling different items of evidence so as to eliminate cross-contamination between those items of evidence, especially when DNA evidence is involved. That's all we have for you today. Thanks for listening.